Money doesn't just buy comfort. It buys a terrifying, impenetrable silence. Claire had $3 billion in assets, a penthouse overlooking the skyline, and hadn't felt a genuine human touch in a decade. So she stripped off her silk, pulled on a frayed thrift store sweater, and lied to a single father whose hands were permanently stained with wood varnish. She told him she was drowning in debt. She just wanted something real. But when a struggling man scrapes together his soul to buy a wedding gift, the truth has a brutal, inescapable way of ripping the world apart. Glass is cold. That was the only thought cycling through Claire's mind as she pressed her forehead against the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office. 70 floors down, the city was a blur of tail-lights bleeding into the slick, rain-soaked asphalt. Up here it was perfectly climate-controlled. 68 degrees, filtered air that smelled faintly of ozone and expensive floor wax. She hated it. Behind her, Harrison, her chief operating officer, a man whose smile never quite reached his perfectly capped teeth, was still talking about the quarterly projections for her global shipping empire. Words like synergy, liquidation, and acceptable collateral bounced off the mahogany walls. Claire didn't turn around. She ran her thumb over the bezel of her platinum watch. It cost more than most people made in 5 years, and it felt like a handcuff. "Claire, are you listening?" Harrison's voice sharpened, shedding its usual sycophantic grease. "I'm leaving," she said. It wasn't a response. It was a statement of fact. She turned, grabbed her coat, a bespoke cashmere trench that weighed almost nothing, and walked out. She left Harrison mid-sentence, ignoring the panicked stutter of her assistant in the outer office. The elevator ride down took 45 seconds. Her ears popped, her chest tight. She didn't call her driver. Instead, she walked out into the freezing November rain. The shock of the cold was a slap she desperately needed. She walked for 6 blocks, letting the damp seep into her Italian leather boots until her toes went numb. She ducked into an alleyway, shivering, and did something she hadn't done since she was a hungry 20-something, building her company out of a roach-infested garage. She went into a dingy, fluorescent-lit thrift shop. The air inside smelled profoundly human. Musty wool, cheap laundry powder, dust, and old shoes. It was glorious. She bought a pair of faded denim jeans, a bulky, pilled grey sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs, and scuffed canvas sneakers. She changed in the cramped dressing room, stuffing her cashmere coat and silk blouse into a plastic shopping bag. She took off her watch, her diamond studs, and her platinum rings, dropping them carelessly into the bottom of her purse. When she stepped back out onto the street, she was invisible. No one looked at her. No one recognized the CEO of the continent's largest logistics firm. She was just another tired woman in a grey city. The diner on 4th Street was a relic. The neon sign buzzed angrily, the R flickering out of existence. Inside, the heat was cranked too high, smelling of burnt coffee, fried onions, and wet mop. Claire slid into a booth covered in sticky red vinyl. The friction of the cheap material against her jeans felt incredibly grounding. She ordered black coffee. It arrived in a thick, chipped ceramic mug, splashing over the side and burning her knuckles. She didn't flinch. She welcomed the sting. That was when she heard the crash. 2 booths down, a little boy, no older than 7, had knocked over a glass of ice water. It shattered on the black and white checkered floor. "Leo, hey, don't move. Don't move, buddy. You'll step on the glass," a voice said. Claire looked over. The man was on his hands and knees, scrambling to pick up the jagged shards before the weary waitress could march over with a broom. He was in his early 30s, wearing a faded flannel shirt rolled up at the elbows. His forearms were corded with muscle. but it was his hands that caught Claire's attention. They were rough, scarred, the knuckles raw, the cuticles stained a deep, permanent mahogany from what looked like wood stain. He was apologizing profusely to the waitress, his voice low, gravelly, and laced with an exhaustion so deep it resonated in Claire's own bones. "I'm sorry, Shirley, I've got it. Put it on my tab," he said, handing her a few damp dollar bills. The boy, Leo, was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his lower lip trembling. "I didn't mean to, Dad. I was just trying to get the crayon." "I know, Bug. It's okay. Accidents happen." The man sat back up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. He looked up, and his eyes met Claire's. They were hazel, tired, shadowed by dark circles, but surprisingly warm. He offered her an apologetic, sheepish half-smile. "Sorry about the noise," he called out softly. "We're a little clumsy tonight." Claire should have looked away. The rules of her world dictated stoicism, indifference. But the pilled wool of her sweater scratched at her collarbone, reminding her she was off the clock. "I've spilled worse," Claire said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, softer. The man paused, studying her for a second. He took in her damp hair, the cheap sweater, the tired slump of her shoulders. He saw someone just like him, a fellow traveller in the grinding machine of the working class. "I'm David," he said. "Claire." "Well, Claire," David said, sliding a sugar packet across the table toward Leo to distract him. "If you're drinking the coffee here, you've already had a rougher night than I have. It tastes like battery acid." A laugh barked out of her throat, sharp and rusty. It was the first time she had laughed in months. "It really does," she said, wrapping her unadorned, ringless hands around the chipped mug. She didn't know it yet, but she had just laid the first brick of a massive, suffocating lie. The lie didn't happen all at once. It seeped into the cracks of their conversations over the next few weeks, like water into a foundation, freezing and expanding until it was structurally load-bearing. They met at the diner twice a week. Claire told her assistant she was taking up evening meditation classes and disappeared into the subway system, leaving her security detail in a state of high anxiety. She learned the transit routes. She learned the precise smell of damp wool coats packed onto a crowded D train. She told David she was a data entry clerk. It was the easiest lie. It explained her exhaustion, her erratic hours, and the blank look in her eyes when she talked about her day. David was a carpenter. He built custom cabinetry for rich people who haggled over his hourly rate while pouring $1,000 bottles of wine. He told her this one night as they walked through the park, the frozen grass crunching under their boots. "They don't see the labor," David said quietly, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "They just see the finished wood. They don't know what it takes to sand down the rough edges until your fingers bleed." Claire shoved her hands deeper into her pockets, a sick, heavy stone settling in her gut. She was they. She had a team of people who managed the contractors, who managed the carpenters. She had fired 50 people last Tuesday to optimize a profit margin. "Does it make you angry?" she asked. David stopped under the yellow halo of a street lamp. He looked at her, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes, but then I come home, and Leo is trying to glue macaroni to the wall, and I realize the rich folks can keep their silent, empty kitchens. I've got noise. I've got life." He reached out then, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently tucking a stray lock of her damp hair behind her ear. His fingers were coarse, calloused, smelling faintly of cedar and cold air. The touch was so painfully gentle, so utterly devoid of an agenda, that Claire's breath hitched. In her world, every touch was a transaction. Every handshake was a contract. This was just a man touching a woman in the cold. She leaned into his hand, a purely instinctual reaction that terrified her. By January, she was practically living a double life. From 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., she was Claire the Titan. She sat in boardrooms, ruthless and immaculately tailored, dissecting supply chains and terminating underperforming executives. Her voice was ice. But at 7 p.m., she stepped out of a taxi 3 blocks from David's apartment, changed her shoes, and walked the rest of the way. David's apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old carpet. Inside, it was cramped, chaotic, and aggressively warm because the radiator hissed and clattered incessantly. There was a worn velvet sofa, a small television, and a kitchen table covered in Leo's homework and David's drafting paper. One evening, Claire stood at the tiny stove, stirring a pot of cheap, generic brand spaghetti sauce. The red sauce bubbled, spitting little droplets onto her wrist. She didn't care. David was sitting at the table, a pair of reading glasses sliding down his nose, agonizing over a stack of bills. The silence in the room wasn't the dead, terrifying silence of her penthouse. It was a living silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the scuff of David's pencil on the paper, the muffled sound of cartoons from Leo's bedroom. "We're going to be short this month," David murmured, rubbing his temples. He wasn't talking to her, just voicing the crushing arithmetic of poverty. "Winter coat for Leo." The heating bill jumped. "I can pick up a weekend shift framing that house out in the suburbs, but then who watches Leo?" Claire froze, the wooden spoon gripped tightly in her hand. A suffocating wave of guilt crashed over her. In her purse, sitting on the counter not 3 feet away, was a black titanium credit card. She could pay off this building. She could buy the construction company David worked for. She could secure Leo's college tuition before the sauce finished simmering. "Tell him," a voice in her head screamed. "Tell him the truth. Write a check and fix it." But she turned her head and looked at him. Looked at the proud set of his jaw, the tired dignity in his posture. If she told him she was a billionaire, the illusion would shatter. He would look at her the way everyone else did, as a bank account, a walking, talking checkbook. The intimacy of their shared struggle, the very thing that bound them together, would evaporate. He would realize she was a tourist in his life, playing dress-up with his reality. Her selfishness was a physical ache in her chest. She wanted him to love her, the broken, tired woman, not the CEO. So she swallowed the truth like broken glass. "I can watch Leo this weekend," she said softly, turning back to the stove. "You go take the shift. I'll stay here." David looked up, the relief washing over his face so profoundly it made Claire want to vomit. He stood up, crossed the tiny kitchen in 2 strides, and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. He buried his face in her neck. "What did I do to deserve you?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Claire closed her eyes, the lie rotting in her mouth. "Nothing," she thought. "You deserve so much better than this." The cracks in her armor began to show in the spring. It was impossible to suppress the instincts of a ruthless corporate strategist forever. You don't build a global empire by being passive, and Claire was, by nature, a predator in a crisis. It happened on a Tuesday. Claire was at David's apartment, helping Leo with his math homework. David was in the kitchen trying to fix a leak under the sink, covered in grime and frustrated. The phone rang. David wiped his hands on a rag and answered it. Claire watched as the blood drained from his face, leaving his tan skin a sickly, ashen grey. He dropped the rag. "What?" "No, that's—" "We signed a contract," David stammered into the receiver. "You can't just terminate the project. I've already fronted the materials. I'm $10,000 out of pocket. Claire's head snapped up. David paced the tiny kitchen, his voice rising, a frantic edge of panic bleeding into his tone. Please, Mr. Henderson, if you cancel this build, I lose my shop. I can't absorb that cost. We had an agreement. He paused, listening. The muscles in his jaw locked. Fine, fine. He hung up, slamming the phone down on the counter. He gripped the edge of the formica, his knuckles turning white, his head bowed. He looked utterly defeated. A man crushed under the wheel. What happened? Claire asked, her voice dangerously calm. Henderson, David choked out, rubbing a hand violently over his face. The big commercial build. He's pulling the contract. Says he found a cheaper firm out of state. Claire, I put everything into the materials for that job. If he pulls out, I'm bankrupt. I lose the business. We lose. He looked around the cramped apartment, terror bright in his eyes. Claire felt the shift happen deep inside her. The timid, tired data entry clerk vanished, instantly replaced by the CEO. Her heart rate slowed, her vision narrowed. Did you sign a master service agreement? Claire asked, her tone suddenly clipped, precise, and devoid of warmth. David blinked, thrown by the sudden authority in her voice. What? A master service agreement, a contract. Did it have a cancellation clause, a kill fee? I think so. Standard boilerplate. But Henderson's got lawyers on retainer. I can't afford to sue him. You don't have to sue him, Claire said, standing up. She walked over to the stack of mail and papers on the counter and began flipping through them with terrifying speed. Show me the contract. Claire, babe, it's no use. Show me the contract, David. It was a command. The kind of command that made vice presidents sweat. David, stunned into compliance, pulled a crumpled folder from his bag. Claire opened it, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with practiced, lethal efficiency. She found the clause in less than 10 seconds. Section 4B. Here, she said, tapping the paper with a manicured fingernail. She had forgotten to rough up her cuticles this week. He's in breach. He missed the cancellation window by 48 hours. If he walks, he owes you 50% of the total project cost plus material reimbursement. It's ironclad. He doesn't care, David said bitterly. He knows I can't afford to enforce it. Give me his number, Claire said. Claire, what are you doing? Give me the damn number, David. She didn't wait. She found the letterhead on the second page, picked up David's phone, and dialed. David watched her, paralyzed by confusion. Henderson Construction, this is Mark, a voice answered. Mark, Claire said. Her voice dropped an octave, smooth, cold, and heavy as a vault door. This is Claire, calling on behalf of David's Custom Carpentry. We need to discuss the breach of contract regarding the downtown build. Look, lady, I already told David. I don't care what you told David, Claire interrupted, her words slicing through the line like a scalpel. I care about Section 4.B of the agreement your office signed on the 12th. You missed the kill fee window. You are currently liable for $14,000 in material costs and penalties. We have lawyers, sweetheart. Good luck. Claire let out a short, terrifying laugh. You have local counsel? Cute. Mark, let me explain how this is going to work. If a cashier's check for $14,000 is not couriered to this address by 10 a.m. tomorrow, I will file a mechanic's lien against the entire downtown property. Do you know what happens to your commercial financing when a lien is placed on the title? The bank freezes your escrow. Your entire multi-million-dollar build halts because you tried to screw a contractor out of 10 grand. You'll lose $50,000 a day in delays. Silence on the other end of the line. Thick, suffocating silence. Now, Claire purred. Do you want to run that by your lawyers, or do you want to cut the check? I'll have to talk to accounting, the man stammered, the arrogance completely gone. 10 a.m. mark, Claire said, and hung up. She put the phone down on the counter. The rush of adrenaline, the thrill of the kill, was still buzzing in her veins. She turned around, expecting to see relief. Instead, David was staring at her. He had taken a step back. His eyes were wide, tracking her movements as if she were a stranger who had just broken into his home. He looked at her posture, straight, commanding, arrogant. He looked at her hands, resting confidently on the paperwork. "Who taught you how to do that?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. The air in the tiny kitchen suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. Claire's stomach dropped. The CEO evaporated, leaving the terrified fraud standing in her place. My old boss," Claire stammered, frantically trying to build a bridge back to the lie. "In data entry, we dealt with a lot of legal files. I picked things up. You hear how they talk to people." David didn't move. He kept staring at her. He looked down at her hands again. "You don't type for a living," he said slowly. "What?" "Your hands. I noticed it a while ago, but I didn't want to say anything." David swallowed hard, looking at her soft, perfectly smooth palms, the lack of calluses on her fingertips. "You don't have keyboard calluses. You don't have paper cuts. Your nails are buffed. I work with my hands, Claire. I know what working hands look like." Panic, hot and sour, flooded her throat. "David, I use a lot of lotion. I don't—" "It's fine," he cut her off, holding up a hand. He rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion returning, heavier than before. "It's fine. You don't have to explain. I know you've got secrets. Everyone does. I've never seen you look like that before." He meant ruthless. He meant cold. He didn't ask any more questions. He just turned and walked into the living room to check on Leo. But as Claire stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of the cheap plumbing sealant mixing with the metallic tang of fear in her mouth, she knew the clock was ticking. The lie wasn't just heavy anymore. It was starting to crack under its own weight, and when it finally shattered, it was going to tear him to pieces. Sawdust coated the inside of Claire's throat. It was late August, and the air in David's un-air-conditioned basement workshop was thick, stagnant, and heavily perfumed with the sharp, peppery scent of cut oak and sweat. A single industrial fan oscillating in the corner did nothing but push the hot dust around. Claire sat on a wobbly wooden stool, watching him work. She was wearing a cheap cotton sundress that clung uncomfortably to her damp skin. David was hunched over the workbench, a sanding block in his hand. He was smoothing the edges of a custom dining chair, his movements rhythmic, hypnotic. His grey t-shirt was stained dark with sweat down the spine. The Henderson check had cleared months ago, exactly at 9:45 a.m., the morning after Claire's phone call, saving the shop from immediate collapse. But it hadn't magically erased the razor-thin margins of his life. He still worked 14-hour days. He still checked the price of milk before putting it in his cart. He stopped, blowing a layer of fine dust off the wood, and looked up at her. His hazel eyes were bloodshot from the floating particulate, but they softened the second they locked onto hers. "You're going to get heat stroke sitting down here," he said, wiping his forehead with the back of a gritty forearm. "I'm fine," Claire lied. In truth, she was dreaming of the blast-chill air conditioning of her penthouse. But leaving meant going back to the silence, and the silence was worse than the heat. David set the sanding block down. He wiped his hands on a rag, slowly, deliberately. He walked over to a battered metal tool cabinet, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in a scrap of old flannel. He didn't get down on one knee. There was no sweeping musical score. There was just the hum of the fan and the distant, muffled rumble of a subway train vibrating through the concrete floor. He walked back to her and stood between her knees. He looked down at his hands, then up at her face. The vulnerability in his expression was a physical blow to her chest. It wasn't the calculated charm of a man who knew he was a catch. It was the raw, terrifying hope of a man who had very little left to lose, asking someone to hold his life. "I don't have a pension," David said quietly, his voice rough. "I don't have a savings account that amounts to much. I have a kid who talks too loud, a truck with a dying transmission, and these hands." He held them up. The knuckles were perpetually swollen, the skin rough as pumice. "It's not a lot to offer a woman." Claire couldn't breathe. Her lungs forgot how to expand. "Stop," her brain screamed. Tell him right now before you ruin him." But her mouth remained firmly, selfishly shut. David unwrapped the flannel. Sitting in his palm was a ring. It wasn't metal. It was carved entirely from a single, continuous piece of dark walnut wood. Down the center ran a thin, meticulously inlaid band of crushed turquoise. It was perfectly polished, smooth as glass, catching the harsh overhead bulb. "I traded a buddy some custom framing for the stone," David murmured, suddenly looking shy. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know it's not a diamond, Claire. I know you deserve the shiny storefront stuff. But I made this. It took me a month of nights after you went to sleep. It's solid. It won't break." He looked at her, his heart entirely outside of his body. "Marry me. Let me build a life for us." Claire stared at the wooden ring. She thought about the 4-carat flawless diamond she kept in a biometric safe in her bedroom. A piece of jewelry she had bought for herself to celebrate a corporate acquisition. A stone that meant absolutely nothing. This little circle of wood weighed 1,000 times more. It was soaked in his exhaustion, his late nights, his pride. It was the most expensive thing she had ever seen. And she was stealing it under false pretenses. Tears, hot and stinging, spilled over her lower lashes. They weren't tears of pure joy. They were tears of profound, localized self-loathing mixed with a desperate, clawing love. She was a parasite, feeding on his goodness. "Yes," she choked out, her voice cracking. David's shoulders dropped, releasing a tension that seemed to have held him together for years. He let out a shaky breath, a wide, luminous smile breaking across his dusty face. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The wood was warm from his pocket. He pulled her off the stool and kissed her, tasting like salt and sawdust. Claire clung to his shirt, digging her fingers into the cheap fabric, closing her eyes tightly to shut out the reality of what she had just done. She had crossed the Rubicon. There was no way to tell the truth now without destroying him completely. Planning a wedding on a shoestring budget when you could personally buy the entire hospitality industry is an exercise in psychological torture. By October, the strain of the double life was eating Claire alive. She was surviving on 3 hours of sleep, espresso, and pure, vibrating anxiety. "You're losing weight," Harrison said, his voice flat, devoid of concern, but heavy with observation. They were sitting in the glass-walled boardroom on the 70th floor. Spread across the table were the final acquisition documents for a European logistics competitor. A deal worth $2.4 billion. "I'm fine," Claire snapped, aggressively signing the bottom of a page with her Mont Blanc pen. "You're distracted," Harrison countered, leaning forward, tapping a manicured finger against the glass. You authorized a severance package for the Munich division that was 30% above our standard algorithm. That's not like you. You're bleeding capital for no reason. It's a rounding error, Harrison. Let them feed their families. Harrison's eyebrows twitched. That was the extent of his shock. Are you ill? Should I contact the board? If you go near the board, I will personally strip your stock options and leave you managing a warehouse in Cleveland, Claire said, her voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan whisper. She didn't look up from the paperwork. Harrison stood up, smoothing his tie. Understood. He paused at the door. Whatever crisis you're managing, Claire, wrap it up. The sharks smell blood in the water. When he left, Claire dropped the pen. Her hands were shaking. She pressed her palms against her eyes, the edges of the heavy diamond ring she had temporarily put back on digging into her skin. At 5 p.m., she would take it off, put the wooden band back on, change into her pilled sweater, and take the subway to Queens to look at a community centre that smelled strongly of chlorine, to see if they could rent it for the reception. That evening, the sensory whiplash nearly broke her. She stood on a scratched plastic pedestal in a discount bridal warehouse. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, emitting a low, headache-inducing hum. The air smelled of acrid, dry-cleaning chemicals and cheap perfume. The saleswoman, chewing a piece of spearmint gum, zipped up the back of the dress. The zipper caught, grinding harshly before locking. It snatches the waist, Hon, the woman said, patting Claire's shoulder. Claire looked in the grease-smudged mirror. The dress was polyester. It was stiff, scratching aggressively against her collarbones, the lace appliques glued on rather than sewn. It cost $250. In her closet at home hung a custom-tailored Valentino gown she had worn to a gala last year, spun from silk so fine it felt like water against the skin. It had cost $40,000. She looked at her reflection, at the tired lines around her eyes, the cheap synthetic fabric suffocating her chest, the wooden ring on her finger. She looked like a fraud, a billionaire playing poverty dress-up. David was sitting on a folding chair outside the dressing room, entertaining Leo with a handful of bent paperclips. He had picked up a third shift. He was working overnight at a commercial construction site, tying rebar, coming home at 6 a.m., sleeping for 2 hours, and then going to his woodshop. His skin had taken on a permanent grey pallor. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass. He was slowly killing himself to pay for the folding chairs, the sheet cake, the cheap polyester dress. Claire stepped out of the dressing room. David looked up. He didn't see the glued-on lace or the stiff fabric. His eyes widened, the exhaustion momentarily vanishing, replaced by a look of such profound reverence it made Claire sick to her stomach. "You look—" He swallowed hard, standing up. "You're beautiful, Claire. So beautiful." "It's too expensive," Claire blurted out. She couldn't stop the words. The guilt was acid in her esophagus. "David, it's $250. I can find something at a thrift store. We don't need this." David frowned, crossing the threadbare carpet. He took her hands, his rough thumbs stroking her knuckles. "Hey, stop. I've got the dress covered. You don't have it covered. You're barely sleeping. You look like a ghost." Her voice was rising, shrill with a panic he misinterpreted as pre-wedding jitters. "Let me pay for it. I got a bonus at the data center, $3,000. Let me just pay for the venue and the dress." She had practically begged him to take the lie money for weeks. She had printed out fake pay stubs on her corporate letterhead machine just to prove it. David's jaw tightened. The pride kicked in, rigid and immovable. "No, I'm the man marrying you. I'm providing this. I told you, I've got a surprise, a gift I'm working on at the shop. The extra shifts are covering it. It's under control." "I don't want a gift," Claire said, her voice cracking, pleading. "I just want you to stop hurting yourself for a lie." "I just want you." "You're getting both," David said softly, kissing her forehead. The stubble on his chin felt like sandpaper against her skin. "Go take the dress off so I can buy it. I have to get to the site in an hour." That night, Claire lay awake in David's cramped bed. The mattress was lumpy, a broken spring digging into her hip. David was out tying rebar in the freezing October rain. Leo was asleep in the next room. Claire rolled over and stared at the digital clock on the nightstand. The red numbers glared in the dark. 2:14 a.m. She carefully slipped out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold linoleum. She crept into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning in protest. On the kitchen table sat David's battered ledger, a black notebook where he kept his finances with meticulous, analog desperation. Claire shouldn't open it. It was a violation. But she was a CEO. She dealt in data. She needed to know the math of his suffering. She flipped open the cover. The pages were filled with his cramped, blocky handwriting. Groceries, $85. Leo's shoes, $40. Rent, $1,200. She flipped towards the back, to the section labelled Wedding. Her breath caught in her throat. The column of numbers was a ledger of self-destruction. He had cancelled his rudimentary health insurance. He was eating one meal a day. She saw the grocery bills had halved over the last month. He was taking advances on jobs he hadn't started yet, a dangerous gamble for a solo contractor. And at the very bottom, heavily circled in black ink, was a line item labelled simply, "The Gift." Beside it was a number that made Claire's blood freeze. $12,000. He was $10,000 in debt to high-interest predatory lenders to build her a wedding present. Claire slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing sharply in the tiny kitchen. She grabbed the edge of the sink, gripping the cold porcelain until her fingers ached and dry heaved. He was destroying his future to give her a present she didn't need. A present she could buy with the spare change in her luxury SUV's cup holder. The lie had metastasized. It was no longer just a wall between them. It was a weapon, and it was bleeding him dry. Panic is a cold, clinical thing when you are used to managing global crises. Claire didn't cry in the kitchen that night. She calculated. She spent the next 3 days trying to anonymously inject money into David's life without triggering his radar. She had her legal team draft a fake inheritance letter, claiming a distant aunt had left him $20,000. David threw it in the trash, assuming it was a phishing scam. She tried to have a local business grant awarded to his carpentry shop. The organizers called him, and his pride flared up. He told them to give it to the bakery down the street that was struggling to make rent. He was impenetrable. His poverty was a fortress built of stubborn, blue-collar dignity. And so, Claire watched him bleed. The week of the wedding, David looked like a man walking to his own execution. The skin beneath his eyes was bruised a deep, permanent purple. He was drinking black coffee by the litre, his hands possessing a faint, constant tremor from sleep deprivation. Every time he smiled at her, a wave of nausea rolled through Claire's stomach. She was a parasite, feeding on his marrow to sustain her own fantasy of a simple life. The wedding was held on a Thursday evening in late November, because the rental fee for the community centre was 70% cheaper on a weeknight. It was sleeting. The sky was the colour of wet cement, the wind howling through the gaps in the aging brick building. Inside, the community hall smelled aggressively of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and chlorine from the adjacent indoor pool. A string of cheap paper bells hung limply from the acoustic drop ceiling. Claire stood in the women's locker room, staring at her reflection in a mirror scarred by hard water stains. The polyester dress felt like a cage, the synthetic lace dug into her collarbones, raising angry red welts on her skin. "You look beautiful, honey," Shirley said. The waitress from the diner had become Claire's de facto maid of honor. She was pinning a wilted corsage of white carnations to her own cardigan, her breath smelling of peppermint schnapps. Claire couldn't speak. Her throat was completely closed. In her purse, sitting on the rusted metal bench next to her, was a burner phone. 30 minutes ago, she had used it to authorize a hostile takeover of a European shipping port, a move that displaced 400 workers. She had done it while sitting on a cracked plastic toilet seat, wearing a discount bridal gown. The cognitive dissonance was fracturing her mind. "Tell him," the voice in her head begged. "Walk out there, pull him aside, and tell him the truth. Let him hate you. He deserves to hate you." But then the locker room door squeaked open, and Leo ran in. He was wearing a clip-on tie and a button-down shirt that was slightly too large in the shoulders. His hair was slicked back with water. "Dad says it's time," the boy said, his eyes wide as he looked at Claire. "You look like a princess." Claire's heart shattered into microscopic pieces. She forced a smile, her lips trembling. "Thank you, Leo. Let's go." The ceremony was agonizingly short and brutally real. There was no string quartet, just a CD player humming in the corner, skipping slightly on a track of acoustic guitar music. The folding chairs groaned under the weight of David's friends, other carpenters, plumbers, waitresses, people who lived their lives in the bruising margins of the city. David stood at the end of the linoleum aisle. He was wearing a rented suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders, the fabric shiny at the elbows. But his face was a study in pure, unadulterated devotion. The exhaustion seemed to vanish the moment Claire stepped into the room. He looked at her like she was the only oxygen left on Earth. When she reached him, he took her hands. His knuckles were raw, a fresh bandage wrapped around his thumb where he had slipped with a chisel yesterday. The contrast between his battered, working hands and her soft, perfectly manicured fingers made her want to scream. The officiant, a tired city clerk moonlighting for $50, began speaking. Claire didn't hear a word of it. She just stared at David's throat, watching the pulse beat steadily against his collar. "I do," David said. His voice was thick, cracking slightly on the vowel. It was her turn. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. The hum of the vending machine out in the hallway seemed to echo like a gunshot. "I do," Claire whispered. It was the biggest lie she had told yet, because the woman standing there, the poor, struggling data entry clerk he was promising his life to, didn't exist. He slid a simple titanium band onto her finger, right above the wooden walnut ring. She kissed him, her eyes squeezed shut, bracing herself for the impact of the inevitable crash. The reception was loud, the kind of loud that bounced off cinder-block walls and rattled your teeth. A cousin of David's had brought a pair of massive, blown-out speakers and was blasting top 40 hits. The buffet consisted of foil trays of baked ziti and a sheet cake from a wholesale club with overly sweet, crusty icing. Claire sat at the head table, 2 folding tables pushed together and covered with a plastic tablecloth, holding a paper cup of lukewarm punch. For the last 2 hours, she had played the part. She had hugged sweating relatives, danced awkwardly to a bass-heavy track, and smiled until her cheek muscles cramped. But the dread was a physical weight on her chest, pressing harder with every passing minute. "Hey," David murmured, materializing behind her chair. He placed a hand on her bare shoulder. The heat of his palm sank through her skin. "Come with me for a second." He didn't wait for an answer. He took her hand and pulled her gently away from the noise, navigating through the maze of folding chairs and running children. He led her out of the double doors of the hall and into a quiet, dimly lit corridor lined with bulletin boards and a humming soda machine. The silence hit Claire like a physical blow. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a sickly, greenish pallor over the cracked floor tiles. David stopped, dropping her hand. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He looked nervous. The confident, grounded man at the altar was gone, replaced by someone vibrating with anxious energy. "I wanted to do this before we go back to the apartment," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He reached into the breast pocket of his rented jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The edges were crumpled, stained slightly with oil from his fingers. "I told you I was working on a gift," he said, holding the envelope out to her. Claire stared at it. The $12,000, the blood money he had wrung from his own body. She didn't want to touch it. It felt radioactive. "David, please," she said, her voice shaking. "You didn't have to." "Take it," he insisted softly. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and took the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy. "Open it." She peeled back the metal clasp and reached inside, pulling out a stack of stapled, legal-sized papers. The top sheet was a commercial lease agreement. Claire blinked, confused. She looked at the address printed at the top. It was a property on 8th and Elm. "It's the old corner shop," David said, a proud, nervous smile breaking across his face. "The one with the big bay windows. We walked past it in April, remember? You said it would make a perfect little bookstore. You said you were so sick of data entry, you just wanted to sit in a quiet room and smell old paper." Claire's lungs seized. She had said that. It was a throwaway lie, a fabricated dream to build out the character of Claire the clerk. "The landlord wanted 12 grand up front for a deposit," David continued, his words spilling out in a rush of adrenaline. "They wouldn't take a standard lease because my credit isn't great. They demanded cash in escrow. That's what the extra shifts were for. It's yours, Claire. The lease is in your name. You can quit the data firm on Monday." Claire stared at the paper. The words were blurring together. He had bought her a business. He had destroyed himself to buy her a fake dream. "David," she choked, the tears finally spilling over, hot and ruinous. "I can't. This is too much. I can't take this." "You already have it," he laughed, stepping closer, wrapping his arms around her waist. "It's done, but there's a weird catch." He pulled back slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. He reached out and tapped the thick stack of papers in her hand. "The management company that owns the building is one of those massive, faceless corporate conglomerates," David said, his tone shifting from joyous to puzzled. "They rejected my application twice, kept getting kicked back by some automated system. I got pissed. I paid a paralegal $100 to pull the public ownership records of the holding company so I could find the actual owner and write them a personal letter. Tell them about you. Tell them why we needed the space." The blood completely stopped moving in Claire's veins. The temperature in the hallway seemed to plummet 20 degrees. David reached out and flipped to the last page of the packet. It was a printout from the state's corporate registry. "I found the master holding trust," David said, his finger tracing a line of bold black ink. "I found the CEO's name. I was going to write the letter, but then..." His voice trailed off. He looked up from the paper, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. The warmth in them was entirely gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow confusion. "Claire," he whispered, "why is your exact name at the top of a $3 billion corporate registry?" Claire stood paralyzed in her cheap polyester dress, clutching the deed to a building her own company owned. The hum of the vending machine grew deafening. It's... She opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. No words came out. David took a step back. His eyes darted from the paper to her face. He was looking at her features, studying the angles of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, as if trying to recognize a stranger in a police lineup. "I thought it was a coincidence," he said, his voice starting to shake. "A joke. Claire Kensington. There's a lot of Kensingtons, right? But then I looked at the corporate filing address. It's the penthouse suite of the glass tower on Fifth Avenue." He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You told me you worked in a data center in Queens." "David, please," Claire finally gasped, stepping toward him, her hand outstretched. He flinched back violently, as if she had swung a knife at him. "Don't touch me," he barked. The sound was a whip crack in the empty hallway. He looked down at the paper again. His mind, wired for logic and mechanics, was assembling the pieces of the puzzle with terrifying speed. "Henderson," he breathed. Claire froze. "The contractor who tried to screw me," David said, his voice rising, bouncing off the cinder block walls. "You called him. You quoted the master service agreement. You threatened him with a mechanic's lien. You didn't learn that doing data entry." He took another step back, hitting the front of the soda machine. The glass rattled. He looked at her hands, the soft, uncalloused hands of a woman who had never typed data for 10 hours a day. "Who are you?" he demanded, the words tearing out of his throat, raw and bleeding. "I'm Claire," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face, ruining her cheap makeup. "I'm still me, David. Everything we have is real. The feelings are real." "The feelings?" David let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was the most agonizing noise Claire had ever heard. "I spent the last 6 months eating ramen noodles so I could afford a $200 dress for a billionaire." He looked at the cheap suit he was wearing. He looked at his ruined, scarred hands. "I almost lost my shop," he whispered, the sheer absurdity of the reality crushing the breath out of him. "I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night since August. I took a $10,000 predatory loan with an 18% interest rate to lease a building from your own company." "I can fix it," Claire cried, dropping the papers. They scattered across the dirty linoleum. She closed the distance between them, grabbing the lapels of his cheap jacket. "David, please. I can write a check right now. I can clear the debt. I can buy the building. I can fix everything." It was the absolute worst thing she could have said. David looked down at her hands gripping his jacket. The disgust that twisted his features was absolute. "You can fix it," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dead, hollow monotone. "You watched me drown, Claire. You sat at my kitchen table, eating my food, watching me panic over a $50 electric bill, and you had a checkbook in your purse that could have bought the whole block." "I was afraid," she screamed, the truth finally ripping out of her. "I was afraid if I told you, you'd just see the money. Everyone just sees the money. I wanted to be normal. I just wanted you to look at me the way you did." David, gently but firmly, pried her hands off his jacket. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. The anger had evaporated, leaving behind a devastation so profound it looked like a physical wound. "You didn't want to be normal," he said quietly, looking at her as if she were a monster hiding in human skin. "You wanted a pet. You wanted to play poor because it made you feel grounded. But poverty isn't a costume, Claire. It's a cage, and you kept me locked in it for your own entertainment." He turned away from her, walking toward the double doors leading back to the reception. "David, wait! Where are you going?" He stopped, his hand resting on the metal push bar of the door. The thumping bass of the music vibrated through the steel. "I'm going to get my son," he said without looking back. "Have your lawyers send the annulment papers to my shop. You know the address?" He pushed the door open and walked into the noise, leaving Claire standing alone in the flickering light, surrounded by the scattered pages of the empire she had built, utterly and completely bankrupt. Silence flooded the penthouse. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a snowy evening. It was the suffocating vacuum of a sensory deprivation tank. Claire sat on the cold Italian marble floor of her master bathroom, still wearing the cheap, scratchy polyester wedding dress. The zipper had jammed when she tried to take it off 3 hours ago. She hadn't bothered to call her assistant or security to help her out of it. She just sat there, knees pulled to her chest, letting the synthetic lace dig angry red welts into her collarbones. The physical discomfort was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. On the vanity above her sat the annulment papers. They had been delivered at 8 a.m. by a courier. David hadn't wasted a single minute. Claire closed her eyes, the metallic taste of old adrenaline lingering on the back of her tongue. Her default setting, her entire survival mechanism, was to fix things with capital. By 9 a.m., she had quietly mobilized her wealth management team. She tracked down the predatory lender holding David's $12,000 debt. She wired the principal, the projected interest, and a brutal $5,000 kill fee to close the account permanently, burying the transaction under 3 dummy LLCs, so David would never see her name. It took exactly 4 days for the money to come back. It arrived via certified mail at her corporate headquarters. A crisp cashier's check for the exact amount she had paid, folded inside a piece of yellow legal paper. There was no letter, just 3 words written in David's blocky, graphite-stained handwriting. "Don't touch us." He had sold his truck. He had pawned his tools. He had done God knows what to scrape together the cash just to purge her money from his ledger. He would rather bleed to death than let her buy his bandages. That was the moment Claire finally broke. She stood up from the marble floor, grabbed a pair of platinum-handled scissors from the drawer, and hacked the polyester dress off her body. The fabric tore with a sickening, cheap sound. She stepped out of the ruined puddle of white, walked into her custom-built, steam-injected shower, and turned the water up until it blistered her skin. She scrubbed at her arms, her chest, her hands, trying to wash off the paralyzing stench of her own arrogance. But when she looked down at her left hand, the walnut band was still there. She had taken the titanium ring off and put it in a safe, but the wooden ring, the one David had carved while his eyes burned with exhaustion, refused to budge. The wood had swelled slightly from the humidity and her own sweat. It was locked around her ring finger, a permanent, physical reminder of the man she had shattered. Winter settled over the city like an iron lid. Claire threw herself into the corporate machine, desperate for the sterile numbness of boardrooms and balance sheets. But the friction of the real world had ruined her for the glass tower. Harrison noticed it first. They were in a strategy meeting regarding a massive logistics warehouse in Chicago. The subcontractors were demanding a renegotiation of their safety stipends. "Starve them out," Harrison advised, checking his gold watch. "They have no union backing. We delay payment for 90 days. They'll fold and sign the original contract." Claire stared at the glossy mahogany table. She didn't see spreadsheets. She saw David's hands. She saw the raw, swollen knuckles. She saw the terrified math in his black ledger as he tried to figure out how to buy his son a winter coat because some faceless corporation was withholding his money. "Pay them," Claire said, her voice dropping like a cinder block. Harrison blinked. "Claire, that sets a dangerous precedent for the Q3 margins." "I said pay them, Harrison, today, and revise the standard operating procedure for all independent contractors. Net zero terms. They get paid the day the invoice is submitted, not 90 days later." "You're bleeding our cash reserves for blue-collar sentimentality," Harrison snapped, finally dropping the sycophantic mask. Claire stood up slowly. She rested her hands on the table. The dark wood of the walnut ring scraped audibly against the polished mahogany. "This company," she said softly, staring a hole straight through Harrison's skull, "will no longer subsidize its profit margins with the sleep and sanity of the people driving the nails. If you have a problem with that, your resignation will be accepted immediately." She walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. It felt good, a tiny, microscopic step. But it didn't fix the hollow ache in her ribs. It didn't bring back the smell of sawdust and cheap coffee. Spring forced its way into the city through the cracks in the pavement. The air smelled of wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, and the faint, bitter tang of blooming crabapple trees. Claire stood on the corner of 14th and Elm, shivering despite the mild April weather. She wasn't wearing a disguise. She wore a tailored black blazer, dark jeans, and leather loafers. No thrift store sweater, no data clerk charade, just Claire. Across the street was David's carpentry shop. The roll-up aluminum door was halfway open, spilling yellow light out onto the cracked sidewalk. The high-pitched whine of a table saw sliced through the ambient city noise. She crossed the street, her heart hammering wildly against her sternum. She ducked under the metal door and stepped into the shop. The air was thick with suspended particulate, smelling intensely of pine resin and machine oil. David was at the far workbench, his back to her. He was running a piece of maple through a planer. He looked thinner. The muscles in his back were sharply defined through his faded grey t-shirt, tightly coiled with a relentless, nervous tension. Claire didn't say anything. She waited until he powered off the machine. The heavy mechanical whine spun down into silence. He turned around to grab a rag and froze. The rag slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. He didn't look angry. He just looked impossibly tired. The bruised shadows under his hazel eyes were darker, carved deeper into his face. "I signed the final annulment papers," David said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warm gravel she remembered. It sounded like dead wood. "The lawyers said it's done. There's no legal tie. You don't need to be here." "I didn't come about the papers," Claire said. Her voice trembled, betraying the confident cut of her blazer. David leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at her clothes, the real clothes, the armor of a billionaire. "So what is this? A hostile takeover of my shop, coming to check on the peasant?" The words stung, precise and lethal, but Claire absorbed them. She deserved the shrapnel. "I came to apologize," she said, taking a single hesitant step forward. "Not to ask for you back, not to fix it, just to apologize, properly, without a checkbook." David let out a harsh, humorless exhale as looking at the ceiling. "Okay, you apologized. Now leave." "I changed the contractor payment terms at my company," Claire blurted out, the words rushing out of her in a desperate flood. "Net zero. Immediate payout upon invoice. It cost the company $40 million in delayed liquid capital holding. I know it doesn't help you. I know it doesn't undo what I did to you. But I couldn't sit in that glass room anymore and pretend I didn't know what was happening on the other side of the spreadsheets." David stopped looking at the ceiling. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Claire, the clerk, or Claire, the deceitful billionaire. He was looking at a profoundly broken woman who was bleeding out on his shop floor. "You think policy changes fix the fact that you watched me starve?" he asked quietly. "No," Claire whispered, the tears finally breaking loose, cutting hot tracks through the sawdust on her cheeks. "I think it proves that I am trying to unlearn the monster I became. I was so terrified of being loved for my money that I completely disregarded your humanity. I made you a prop in my own twisted therapy session, and it was the most unforgivable thing I have ever done." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "You were right. Poverty isn't a costume. The fear you carry, the math you do in your head every time you open a grocery bill. I didn't respect it. I trivialized it, and I am so deeply sorry." The silence in the shop was heavy, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. David stared at the floor. The rigid, defensive posture in his shoulders slowly unspooled, just a fraction. He reached down, picked up the rag, and wiped his hands. "Leo asks about you," he said. The words were quiet, a painful concession. "I told him you had to move away for work. I didn't have the heart to tell a 7-year-old that the woman he was drawing pictures for was a ghost." Claire's breath hitched. A physical pain shot through her chest at the mention of the boy. "I miss him. I miss you. Every single day." David finally looked up. His eyes dropped from her face down to her hands. He froze. Claire's left hand was clutching the edge of her blazer. Sitting on her ring finger, dark and polished against her pale skin, was the walnut band. David's breath caught. He pushed off the workbench, taking 2 slow steps toward her. "Why are you still wearing that?" "It got stuck," Claire lied, her voice cracking. David stopped a foot away from her. He looked at the ring, then up at her eyes. He knew wood. He knew exactly how much moisture it took to swell a ring, and he knew exactly how easy it was to cut off with a $2 jeweler's saw. "You didn't cut it off," he murmured. "No," Claire admitted, dropping the lie. She looked down at the band. "It's the most valuable thing I own. It's the only real thing I have." David swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw jumped. The betrayal was still there, vast and ugly, an ocean between them. A 5-minute apology wasn't a bridge. You couldn't erase months of psychological manipulation with a speech. But as he looked at her standing in the sawdust, stripped of her lies, terrified and vulnerable in a way she had never been, the ice cracked. "Just a hairline fracture." "I can't trust you, Claire," David said. His voice was raw, bleeding honesty. "I don't know how to look at you and not see the person who watched me bleed." "I know," she whispered. "I don't want your money. I don't want your connections. If my shop goes under, it goes under. That's my burden." "I understand." David looked at the ring on her finger one last time. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, scrubbing a hand over his face. "The diner on 4th Street, he said slowly. "The one where you spilled the coffee. I take Leo there on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. for pancakes." Claire's heart stopped. She didn't dare move. "I don't have time for games," David continued, his hazel eyes locking onto hers, fierce and uncompromising. "I don't have energy for lies. If you show up, you pay for your own coffee, and you tell me the truth about exactly who you fired this week. No costumes, no bullshit." Claire nodded slowly, terrified that if she spoke, the fragile thread connecting them would snap. "No costumes," she whispered. "Just me." David held her gaze for a long moment, the air thick with unresolved grief and a terrifying, tentative hope. Then he turned back to the workbench, hit the power button on the planer, and let the mechanical whine drown out the silence. Claire stood there for a few seconds, letting the smell of the cut wood fill her lungs. Then she turned and walked out into the cool April night. She didn't call her driver. She walked to the subway, swiped her card, and stood on the crowded platform. She bumped shoulders with tired nurses and night shift cooks holding onto the metal handrail. She was a billionaire. She was a CEO. She was deeply flawed, But as her thumb traced the smooth, dark wood of the ring on her finger, she finally felt like she was a part of the real world. And for the first time in 10 years, she was ready to do the actual work. If this story hit you where it hurts, hit that like button right now. We all crave something real in a world obsessed with the price tag. But Claire and David's journey proves that true connection can't be bought. It has to be built, blister by blister. What would you have done in David's shoes? Forgiven her, or walked away forever? Drop your raw thoughts in the comments below. I want to read them all. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that love is labor. And don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human stories.